Imagine starving yourself in a freezing forest for like an entire year, completely silent, just totally cut off from the world.
Right, which sounds intense enough on its own.
Yeah, but then imagine being told that your massive physical sacrifice is spiritually identical to a vain influencer posing for a charity selfie just to get likes.
It's honestly a brutal comparison.
It sounds incredibly harsh. But today, our mission for you in this deep dive is to unpack a razor-sharp 15th century text that makes exactly this kind of uncompromising comparison.
Yeah, it really doesn't hold back.
We're looking at a profound composition by Phragat Kabirji, specifically a text set in the musical measure of Rag Sorath. And, we are going to examine this intense, often uncomfortable distinction between performing the aesthetic of a belief system.
And actually living it.
Yeah.
Exactly. The psychological critique embedded in this text is astoundingly relevant to how we operate today.
Totally.
Because Bhagat Kabirji was observing a society that was, well, entirely obsessed with the mechanics of piety.
Like checking the box.
Exactly. He systematically looks at the scholars, the extreme ascetics, the beautifully adorned musicians, and he asks them all the same terrifying question. Are you actually doing the internal work, or have you just, mastered the external show?
So let's start with where the human brain usually defaults when it wants to prove its worth, right? Intellectualism and following the rules.
Always the first line of defense.
Right. So the opening lines of the text describe people listening to the teachings of the Vedas and the Puraanas, hoping to secure some sort of spiritual success or salvation by meticulously performing religious rituals.
Yeah, and for a bit of context here, we aren't just talking about reading a few hymns.
Right. In the 15th century, what did it actually mean to master these specific texts? Because it was a big deal.
Oh, it was a massive deal. It meant you were the absolute intellectual elite. The Vedas and the Puraanas are these incredibly complex compendiums of ancient philosophy, cosmology, and highly specific ceremonial instructions.
So it's not light reading.
Not at all. To be a pandit, a wise man or scholar of these texts, required a lifetime of rigorous memorization and study. These individuals held immense authority.
Because they were basically the gatekeepers, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Society viewed them as the gatekeepers of salvation because they knew exactly which chant to recite, which fire to light, which ritual to perform to satisfy the divine.
It's like inputting a cheat code.
Right. It was a heavily transactional view of the universe. If you input the correct ceremonial code, you output spiritual security.
Which makes Bhagat Kabirji's observation so subversive.
Yeah.
Because he looks at these elite, highly respected scholars and points out a glaring flaw.
And it's a big one.
Yeah. The text explicitly states that despite their vast knowledge, these so-called wise men are ultimately caught by death.
Yeah, the rules don't save them.
Right. He watches the foremost experts meticulously perform every ritual on the checklist and then realizes that the checklist doesn't actually save them from mortality or, spiritual emptiness.
He essentially announces his resignation from their entire system. He's just like, I have abandoned the desire to perform these rituals at all.
Because what Kabir is exposing here is the human desire for measurable safety.
Exactly. Performing a complex ritual or memorizing a text is safe because it's quantifiable. You could check it off a list.
You read the chapter. You poured the water at the correct angle.
Right, but genuine internal vulnerability, actually surrendering your ego to a higher power, is terrifying because it cannot be measured.
You can't put that on a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So humanity naturally substitutes the messy, unquantifiable work of internal growth with the highly controllable mechanics of external rituals.
It perfectly mirrors a phenomenon you see on college campuses all the time.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Right. Think about a student who is desperate to be seen as a high achiever. Instead of actually sitting down with a difficult textbook and wrestling with concepts they don't understand, they go out and buy like a $200 letter-bound planner.
The absolute best, most expensive Japanese stationery.
Exactly. They perfectly color code their schedule with 6 different highlighters, and they talk endlessly to anyone who will listen about their complex productivity system.
But they haven't actually studied anything.
Exactly. The brain is actively tricking itself. The dopamine hit that student gets from purchasing the planner and color coding the schedule feels remarkably similar to the satisfaction of actually learning.
They've successfully performed the aesthetic of studying without subjecting themselves to the difficult, messy friction of, actual learning.
And the tragic part is, the core objective is entirely ignored. Which brings us to the Raho section of Kabir's text.
A central pause.
Right, the thematic anchor around which the rest of the composition revolves. He addresses his own mind directly with a very tough critique. He says, "O mind, you have not completed the only task you were given."
You bought all the expensive stationery, you did all the extra credit, but you completely failed the primary assignment.
Right, so what is that primary assignment? The text clarifies that this one essential task is meditating on the Lord, the ultimate sovereign.
But the mind gets easily seduced by the performative aspects.
The gathering of knowledge.
Right, the social status of being a scholar, the comfort of the ritual, and it completely neglects the central directive.
Which is forging a genuine, internal, loving connection.
Precisely. But here's the thing. If the intellect fails, and following the rule book of the scholars fails, the natural human instinct is usually to violently swing the pendulum in the exact opposite direction.
Oh, totally. Like, if society's comforts and rituals are a distraction, the logical next step is to abandon society and punish the physical body.
Right. So does Bhagat Kabirji see physical asceticism as a valid alternative to the scholars?
I mean, he anticipates that exact pivot and just systematically dismantles it.
Completely. The composition moves into a sharp critique of extreme physical deprivation.
That describes individuals who flee into the forests to practice austere yoga and deep meditation, deliberately removing themselves from every conceivable comfort.
Living solely on whatever roots and fruits they can forage.
Yeah, they aren't just camping. They are intentionally subjecting their physical forms to immense suffering.
And Kabir introduces a terrifying concept here to describe their ultimate fate. He says they remain on the register of death.
Right. In the original language, this is referred to as jam or kaal. What is the actual mechanism behind this register?
Well, a register of kaal isn't merely like a mythological ledger. It's a metaphorical accounting of those trapped in a perpetual cycle of spiritual death and ego-driven illusion.
Okay, so it's a state of being.
Right. It represents a state of existence where, despite your most exhausting efforts, you remain completely disconnected from the eternal.
And Kabir categorically places everyone we've discussed onto this fatal register. The Vedic scholars, the chanters of single words.
The people who take extreme vows of silence, and the yogis starving in the forest.
Okay, I have to pause and challenge the text logic on this because it feels incredibly counterintuitive. Well, if a person literally walks away from their family, their wealth, and their warm bed, and chooses to survive on raw roots in a freezing forest while taking a vow of absolute silence for a year.
Yeah.
How can they possibly be placed on the same register of death as an arrogant scholar in the city? Isn't giving up your entire life the ultimate sacrifice? What more could the divine possibly want from them?
I get it. And that tension you're feeling is exactly what the text is engineered to provoke.
Okay.
You have to ask yourself, what is actually being sacrificed in the forest?
Well, their physical comfort, obviously.
Right, and they've sacrificed their societal normalcy.
Yeah.
But they haven't sacrificed the one thing that actually matters, their ego.
Oh, wow. So the extreme suffering is just a different vehicle for arrogance.
Precisely. The ego is incredibly adaptable. When it can no longer attach itself to wealth or intellectual status in the city, it simply attaches itself to its own extreme discipline in the forest.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The internal narrative becomes, look at how uniquely holy I am.
Exactly. Look at how much more I can suffer than the average person. I haven't spoken in a year, therefore the universe owes me enlightenment.
It's still transactional.
Exactly. The physical location changed and the diet changed. But the internal state, the profound lack of genuine loving surrender, remains identical.
They're still relying on a self-generated mechanical process to force a spiritual transaction.
And because their asceticism is still entirely rooted in their own vanity and effort, the register of death remains their reality.
The currency just changed from intellectual knowledge to physical pain, but they're still trying to buy something that isn't for sale.
That is a heavy realization.
It really is. So escaping to the forest doesn't save you. But what about the people who stay in society and simply adopt the visual markers of a holy person?
Well, having invalidated the scholars and the ascetics, the text turns its focus to the hypocrisy of spiritual aesthetics.
Right. It explicitly calls out the act of adorning the physical body with religious symbols or beautiful clothing while lacking internal devotion.
Because Kabir notes that pampering and decorating the body is fundamentally absurd. Since the physical vessel is temporary anyway, It must ultimately be given up to the earth.
It's like spending your entire life painting the walls and hanging expensive chandeliers in a house that you know is scheduled for demolition tomorrow.
That is such a good way to put it.
Right,
Oh,
completely ignoring the fact that you need to build a permanent foundation somewhere else.
yeah, it's an investment in an illusion. You can wear the specific robes associated with piety. You can paint the culturally appropriate religious marks on your skin, and you can carry the exact holy items required by your tradition.
But Kabir bluntly states that if loving devotional worship does not enter into your heart, all of that decoration is just a costume.
Just a costume.
Yeah.
And the text gets incredibly specific about one particular type of performative art, which is music.
Yes, it says, "You sit and play music, but you are still a hypocrite. What do you expect to receive from the Lord?"
And we have to unpack the profound irony here because, the listener needs to understand that Thagat Kabirji's own words are literally being sung.
Right. This entire composition is formatted in a specific musical measure called Rag Sorath. So he clearly isn't arguing that music itself is evil.
Far from it. The critique is centered on the weaponization of aesthetics.
The phrase used in the text is Rag Ragne, pointing to the technical performance of musical measures.
Yeah, and to understand the irony, you have to understand the function of a rag. Rag Sorath is specifically designed to evoke a very particular emotional state.
Usually a deep, almost painful sense of yearning, vulnerability, and detachment from the world, reaching out for the divine.
Right, so Kabir is pointing out the ultimate hypocrisy here, sitting in front of a congregation, technically executing the complex mathematics of Rag Sorath perfectly to evoke tears from the audience.
While your own heart is completely empty and emotionless, you're wearing the skin of devotion without the heartbeat.
Man, that's powerful.
It makes me think of a very modern phenomenon. Imagine a high-profile influencer who decides they need some good PR, so they go do charity work at a soup kitchen.
Oh, we've all seen this video.
Exactly. But before they hand a single bowl of food to an unhoused person, they spend 30 minutes directing their camera crew.
They adjust the ring lights.
Right. They make sure the logo on their designer volunteer shirt is visible, and they practice their most empathetic, sorrowful facial expression in the mirror.
And the act itself, giving food to someone who is starving, is technically beneficial to the world.
Just as singing a hymn perfectly is technically beautiful to the ear.
Exactly. But the internal mechanism driving the action is entirely corrupt.
Because the influencer isn't at the soup kitchen to connect with a suffering human being. They're there to extract a performance of goodness to feed their own vanity and boost their engagement metrics.
And the text asks a devastating rhetorical question to that exact influencer or to that hypocritical musician. What do you expect to receive from the Lord?
Kabir is saying, if your entire action was designed to extract applause from an audience, or to satisfy your own ego, then that applause is your only reward.
The transaction is complete.
Right. You cannot expect a profound, eternal spiritual connection when your core intention was entirely superficial.
So if we take a step back, the structure of Kabir's argument leaves us utterly painted into a corner.
We really are. We've established that the intellectualism of the scholars fails.
The intense physical sacrifice of the forest yogis fails.
And the beautiful aesthetics of the musicians and the visually devout fail. He has systematically dismantled every single metric that human society universally recognizes as holy.
It kind of leaves you wondering if spiritual success is even possible, or if everyone is just doomed to the register of death.
Right, but that feeling of being cornered is intentional. The text actually heightens that despair before offering a resolution.
It reiterates the ultimate stakes, warning that death has fallen on the whole world, specifically highlighting that even the doubting religious scholars are caught in its snare.
Kabir strips away every human-made safety net so that only one singular truth remains.
And what is the antidote he finally presents? What is the one thing that actually works?
It is a concept called Prem Bhakti.
Prem Bhakti. The direct translation of that is loving devotional worship.
Yes, and the key word there is loving.
Not fearful worship, where you are trying to appease an angry deity.
And not transactional worship, where you're trying to buy a ticket to heaven with rituals or starvation.
And certainly not performative worship, where you're trying to impress your community.
Right, Prem Bhakti is a profound psychological shift. It's the movement away from doing things for the divine to earn a reward, and shifting simply toward loving the divine for its own sake.
Which brings us to the climax of the text, where a very specific, historically weighty word appears.
The text says Kabir, those humble people become pure. They become Khalsa, who know the Lord's loving devotional worship.
Let's try to define this based entirely on the logic Kabir has laid out.
Because, given everything we've discussed about stripping away external uniforms, rituals, and physical asceticism, Khalsa in this 15th century context cannot possibly refer to a physical appearance or a political faction.
No, it has to represent an internal baseline, and that is an incredibly important distinction to make.
Right.
The word Khalsa derives from the Arabic word khalis, which implies something that is absolutely pure, unadulterated, and unblemished.
Historically, it also referred to land or property that belonged directly to the emperor, right?
Right.
Without any middlemen or local lords taking a cut.
Exactly. So in the context of this specific verse, Bhagat Kabirji defines Khalsa purely as a state of internal liberation. A person becomes Khalsa when their connection to the ultimate sovereign is direct and entirely motivated by Prem Bhakti.
It bypasses all the middlemen, the scholars, the rule books, the societal expectations.
Exactly. Achieving that purity, becoming Khalsa, means you're finally freed from the anxiety of the register of death.
You're no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of trying to prove your worth through mechanical ceremonies or ego-driven suffering.
The purity Kabir describes isn't about having a spotless moral checklist. It's about the pure, unadulterated intention of love.
So, synthesizing all of this for you, the listener, the journey this text takes us on is a radical deconstruction of how we assign value to our actions.
Because we aren't all 15th century Vedic scholars or yogis eating raw roots in a freezing forest.
Thankfully.
Yeah, but human nature hasn't changed. We all have our own modern checklists.
We all have ways we try to prove our worth through the sheer exhaustion of our efforts or the aesthetic perfection of our lives.
And applying Prem Bhakti to a modern context requires a highly uncomfortable level of self-interrogation.
It really does. It means constantly looking at your daily actions and demanding honesty regarding your underlying motives.
Right. If you are practicing mindfulness, are you doing it to actually center your chaotic mind? Or are you doing it so you can seamlessly drop the phrase, my meditation practice, into conversations at dinner parties?
Or, are you staying late at the office because you deeply care about the quality of your work or because you desperately need the identity of the office martyr?
It's the fundamental difference between living a transactional existence and a relational one.
A transactional existence is exhausting because the ego always needs a new receipt to prove it exists. You constantly need more applause, a longer fast, or a more complex ritual to feel safe.
But Kabir is arguing that true purity, becoming Khalsa, only happens when the action itself becomes the reward, driven entirely by genuine intention and love.
Which is why this ancient text remains so threatening and so vital. It strips away all of our carefully constructed defenses and forces us to realize that no amount of outward performance can substitute for internal substance.
That is the perfect encapsulation of Bhagat Kabirji's message in Rag Saraf.
It is a powerful demand to audit the architecture of our own lives. And that brings us right back to the counterintuitive scenario we started with.
Full circle.
We have spent this deep dive exploring how easily the human mind substitutes the aesthetic of an action for the reality of it. So I want to leave you with a thought to mull over on your own today.
It's a good one.
Based on the logic of Kabir's critique, if the register of death represents the endless, exhausting consequence of a life lived entirely for superficial performance.
Wait, if it represents a life lived just for the show, what is one performative ritual in your own daily life that you need to strip away today to uncover what is actually genuine?